Before we get started, just a very couple quick announcements. One is that a number of you have asked about the next Positioning Theory Conference for 2026. We don't have a formal announcement for that yet, but we are hoping to have an announcement soon. So stay tuned. We will be posting information for that and pushing that out as soon as we have that. And please be patient with us on that front. Okay, just a couple of reminders for upcoming talks that you can register for. Remember, you need to individually register for all of these talks. We have a special engagement. Usually our talks happen once a month or around that time frame, but we actually have another special talk engagement next week that is presented by Ali Moghadam, who many of you will be familiar with as one of the co-authors and also lead author on many texts dealing with positioning theory, but also many other works. And Ali will be talking about democracy, diversity, and the appeal of authoritarianism, the omniculturalism solution. In the registration document, he also sent a list of different books that he has published across the last few years that are the works that will ground this talk. So rather than having two talks for this particular session, we will have one talk followed by an opportunity to discuss and ask questions of Dr. Moghadam. So please attend, share this out also if you have the students or others, friends, colleagues who might be interested in this work. Likewise, with our March 13th talk, we will have two more talks that are scheduled. And so please also feel free to share the link for registration for these two talks that will be presented on March 13th. So we look forward to that as well. Just a reminder, the positioning handbook is out, and today's chapter, our presenter will be Susilo Wibisono is here with us from the University of Queensland. We are so thankful for him to take time, especially at a inconvenient time for him to be here and to present the work from this chapter that was co-authored with Winnifred Lewis. So our other talk, if folks had been interested in the work that we had also listed originally from Jui Liu, unfortunately she could not join us today and will not be here. So we'll just have the one talk followed by questions and discussions. And I think those are all of my announcements. So without any further ado, I am going to stop sharing this and I am going to turn things over to Susilo. And you can introduce yourself however you see fit or launch into your talk. We're so pleased to have you here today. Welcome.
I'm sharing my screen now just to make sure that everyone can see it.
Okay. I'm seeing it. There you go. That's the full screen mode.
So it's
You
a
should
full
be
screen
good.
now.
Okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Susilo Wibisono. I'm from the University of here in Australia, and it's me and my postdoc supervisor, Professor Winnifred Lewis, who unfortunately cannot make it to come today this morning because, yeah, it's in the middle night here in Australia. And she send her regards to everyone in this virtual talk session. So the title that we give for our chapter is Positioning Theory in the Context of Intergroup Peace and Conflict. And I would like to start it with the reason why we put this chapter, because, I mean, our background is actually in social psychology, and one of the topic in social psychological research is actually about intergroup peace or intergroup relations in more generally, and it's mostly related to the conflicting relationship or peaceful relationship. And there is a strong traditions of experimental research within social psychology, and for some extent, it overlooks the historical and cultural context around those intergroup relationships, including the context of peace and conflict. And the orientation of the social psychological research is mostly about how the conclusion can be generalized across different population or different uh, groups, while the conflict or peace relationship is strongly related to the local context, to the historical context, or we call it as the particularistic nature of conflict. And sometimes it didn't match the research traditions in social psychology and the nature of conflicts, which is very related to the complex situations around this conflict, especially related to the local values and historical background of the conflict. And we believe that intergroup conflict and peace cannot be understood through the deterministic cause-effect relationship, such a very mainstream tradition in social psychology. That's why we created an experimental research to prove that one thing is a cause for the other, and the other thing is the effect of particular causes. So by using this chapter, we try to bridge the gap uh, with positioning theory by emphasizing context-sensitive analysis of positions, acts, or speech acts, and storylines, and we try to integrate the universal elements with particularized realities. The chapter that we have, we also acknowledge the past work on positioning analysis or positioning theory in the context of conflict and peace that was edited by Ali Mogadam, Ramhari, and others. So we call it as the groundbreaking work on positioning theory and conflicts. And there are some points, some important points that we can take from this book that was published in 2008. So the first point is that conflicts and peace are framed and understood through the narratives, the statements or the speech acts, the utterance that was delivered by the parties involved in the social relationship or in the conflict or in the peaceful relationship. So people position themselves within these narratives, which can escalate or de-escalate tensions. And then positioning theory provides a way to analyze conflicts by examining how individuals or groups assign their rights and duties to themselves and others. So the way people position themselves and position others in the social interaction will have implications on assigned duties or assigned rights in relation to their position. And positioning theory also look at word and believe that word have power in conflicts. So it's mostly about the rhetoric used by leaders or the followers, but mostly it's about what the leaders say, and because the leaders are mostly perceived as the representation of the groups, and the followers will tend to follow their leaders. So the rhetoric used by leaders and followers in the social relationship, and this word can intensify or de-intensify the hostility, which is a very important factor within conflicting relationship. So there is an opportunity that we can bring by using positioning theory, because by analyzing positioning moves, we can identify opportunities to reframe the narratives. So for example, from hateful narratives into more peaceful narratives, and chilling rigid storylines, and create openings for resolutions and dialogues. And this is the beginning of our chapter. And in chapter 22 in the positioning theory handbook. And firstly, we define peace and conflict by using positioning theory framework. So conflict arises when individuals or groups occupy different positions in social hierarchy, and these positions are perceived as unequal or unjust, while peace is when individuals or groups negotiate their positions, right, duties, and storylines to create and maintain non-violent relationship. And positioning theory analyzes social interactions evolving over time as gradually develop structures of meanings ordered accordance with group norms. And the outcomes that we expected from the use of positioning theory to understand conflict and peace is that we can understand the situation specific meanings. So the meanings behind the word or the utterance delivered by a person or mostly a person that perceived as the representation of the groups, so we can also understand the meaning behind the narratives or the meaning behind the statement, because there is local dynamics or power dynamics behind the statement. And we can also understand the context-specific rules as the consequence of how individuals or groups position themselves or how they position others in that context. Specific meanings and the context-specific rules, we can also understand the meaningful social actions in the social relation, what the individuals or the groups act in the context of that social relationship in relation to the peaceful or conflicting situation. So in the conflict situation, firstly, when individual or when groups position themselves as the opposite of the other groups, there are some consequences in relation to the rights and duties, and those rights and duties are often contested, where competing parties assert different entitlement and responsibilities. So, and it also related to the idea of identities, how individuals and groups define themselves and how they label and being labeled by the others. So it's not only affect the assigned rights and duties, but it also affects how they perceive the others' rights and duties. And it can reinforce or challenge the structure of the conflict and peace. So this is the first element of the positioning theory when we talk about positions and how these positions have implications on the rights and duties and also perceived rights and duties of the other groups. And then second element, which is acts or speech acts. So it can reinforce or challenge the positions signed by the groups, and whether through statements, actions, or symbolic gestures, especially when we talk about acts. So acts can shape power dynamics and influence whether conflict escalates or de-escalates. So it can create the shift from the current situation, whether the social relationship between two groups or more involved in the um, peace or conflict situation. So it can be better, which means turn into more peaceful social relationship, or it can be worse, which is turn into more conflicting social relationship. So by the group here, we actually talk about like diverse range of the group from small group to the large group, like country or nation or even religious groups, etc. And then the third element of the positioning theory, when we talk about storylines, so these storylines provide the broader narratives that justify or challenge the positions and acts, and in conflicts, opposing groups construct competing storylines to explain their actions, to attribute blame, or to establish legitimacy. So storylines is the main stories that a group deliver to justify their positionings and also to justify their acts or speech acts. They may have different storylines relating to the same object, and those storylines might be contested to justify their positions. And these narratives are powerful tool in shaping public perception and mobilization. So we try to apply this theoretical framework in the context of recent conflicts in the Middle East. So we studied the speech by a former Hezbollah leader. He was killed by Israel on September or October last year, but we downloaded all the speech that this guy delivered in through their website from the first attack of Hamas into Israel on October 7, 2023. And then you try to use the positioning theory framework to identify the positioning, rights, duties, acts, speech acts, and the storylines in general across the speech. And then what I present here is the sample of our analysis from the first speech after October 7, 2023. And then we identify the positioning. So firstly, there are some theme in relation to the positioning, which include the self-positioning. So how they position themselves as spiritual and moral guide, and then how they position others in this conflicting relationship between Hezbollah and Israel. So while they position themselves and their groups as the spiritual and moral guide, at the same time, they position their opposite group or Israel in this context as barbaric, tyrannical, and then they also created putting Hezbollah and its allies as part of the resistance axis and Israel and its allies as part of the systemic operation. And this positioning has consequences in relation to the rights and duties. For example, they feel that they have rights to engage in violent resistance or armed resistance, and they believe that this resistance is legitimate or even morally oblique. And they also put the victims of those, they also position the victims of those conflicts as martyrs, and position this martyrs with a very positive and spiritual values, as the citation that I put here. And then this positionings has a link, strongly linked to the acts or the speech acts, which is the call to action. There is an explicit call for global solidarity and action. So they call for other groups across the world to show their global solidarity, which means to support them in this in the resistance or in this conflicting relationship. And they and part of the call is that they legitimate the resistance that they show as moral or religious or even as humanitarian obligation. So the general storylines that we identify from this first speech after the attack on October 7, 2023 is there is a clear narrative of resistance. So this is the main point of the main storyline that we can identify from this speech. And then there is also narratives about martyrdom, and they perceive that this martyrdom is a victory. So it's a call to people that do not need to worry about the conflict because although they gonna die in this conflict, so they will be labeled or they will be positioned as the martyr, and they perceive that this martyrdom as a victory because represented by the freedom from, for example, American arrogance, Zionist theory, tyranny, and there is no aggression, no murder, and no massacre. So this is how they define the martyrdom as victory as part of this storyline. And there is also narratives that frame international organizations and nations as complicit in Israel's action through silence or support. So there is a kind of collective victimhood in their narratives, and this collective victimhood is also related to the rights, assigned rights and duties. Well, they believe that they have moral obligation to engage in the resistance action. So that's the part of our study on how to use this positioning theory framework and understand this part of our study in the current intergroup conflict that's very salient in the world. And then the next point that we also wrote in the chapter is about valuing historical narratives, because firstly, we have to understand real conflict and peace, especially in the context of intergroup conflicts, as something that span generations with historical narratives shaping current grievances and alliances. And conflicting groups justify their action based on historical rights and duties. So it's very important to look back to the historical relationship between the groups that have conflicting or peaceful relationship, especially when we have an orientation to shift or to turn this conflicting relationship into more peaceful relationship. The longer the historical narratives that we need to look, so it will be more complex to understand the historical narratives behind the conflicting relationship, and this historical narratives shape conflict interpretation. So that's why it's very important to look back to the historical backgrounds of the conflict. And historical narratives also help to predict the shift of the identities and the power dynamics and the potential peace-building opportunities. And historical narratives go beyond immediate conflicts to include experiences of empowerment, betrayal, or resilience. Sometimes it's not only about black and white groups, some like more gray area. It's not only about that. I mean, the most common narratives about conflict is like I'm right and you are wrong, but actually the nature of conflict is more complex than just right or wrong, because there is a betrayal, there is a rest, there is struggles, there is like only belong to one of the groups involved in the conflict. So practically, by understanding these historical narratives, conflict resolution strategies can use these narratives to reframe intergroup relations. So we can look back at the past, how the past relationship between these groups, and we can build narratives to look back those more positive relations. Just focus on the more positive especially when we talk about the shared stories and common experiences that can reduce polarization and foster mutual understanding. So one example that we put in our chapter is about the peace building attempts in Rwanda. So after the bloody conflict between Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994, and then how the young generations of Rwanda try to use their past histories, their shared histories to strengthen their national identities, and then to put this national identity as Rwanda over their ethnic identities as Hutu or as Tutsi. Yeah, this is one point that I think very important, and we also put this point in our chapter. It's about how researchers should also look at themselves, look at their positioning, look at their experiences, understanding their subjectivity and potential for biases when they do analysis, for example. So sometimes it's quite difficult, especially when we position ourselves as researchers, and then we try to understand conflict, and our identity might be related to one of the groups engaged in the conflict. So the idea that we have about it, like the doing research in positioning theory, might involve more than a single person, especially in relation to to doing the analysis and how we can ensure the analysis reliable across the individuals who do the analysis. Because researchers' personal and group factors, for example, their social identity, might influence the way they analyze the narratives from actors involved in the conflict or from the bystanders of the conflict. From this perspective, scholars on rights and duties are also open to be interrogated. So critical reviews are very important to look at the researchers' work using positioning theory, especially when they focus on the conflicting and peaceful relationships. And then at the end of our chapter, we talk about more practical stuff. So we call it as something beyond research. So it's how we use positioning theory as a framework to turn conflicting relationship and shift it into more peaceful relationship. So the first point is about how we shift the narratives from monologues pattern to more dialogical pattern of the narratives. And then by balanced dialogical perspective and balanced dialogical perspective is important to overcome ignorance of others' positions and storylines, because in the conflict situations, each groups, they mostly focus on their own narratives, and they tend to ignore what other groups say. They tend to not listening to what other groups, the aspirations of other groups, or what other groups tend to say in relations to the relationship. So this is the first thing that we put in the chapter, that we should shift this monological pattern of the narratives into more dialogical patterns. And then they should recognize their own positions and biases in order to better understand how they might contribute to conflict. And by understanding this turning monologue into dialogue, the interventions can be developed through better formed storylines about the actors involved in the conflict to redefine the conflict itself. So it's also related to how we could use historical narratives to create more positive storylines about other groups, and then change the positions of other groups from, for example, from the enemies to more positive relationship. And then the second point that we put in the chapter about more practical stuff using positioning theory is about making salient silence voices and latent conflicts. So sometimes it's not only about leaders who speak on behalf of their groups or their followers, but those followers actually have voices to be listened. So the nature of conflict is not only reflected in silent oppositional narratives, but also in marginalized voices omitted. So that's why the current research about conflict is mostly not just focused on what the leaders say in relation to the conflict, but also the citizens' voices represented, for example, through social media conversations or media conversations, mostly social media conversations, like scraping social media chats or social media conversations through uh, digital apps like Reddit or X or Facebook, Instagrams, and these voices that mostly ignored actually very important to understand the nature of conflict between the groups. And it also about the latent conflicts because not all conflicts are observable. Sometimes they are latent, and we need to make these latent conflicts to become more explicit to get more concrete solutions about the conflicts. So successful intervention is achieved through the willingness to turn past conflictual stories into stories that promote agency, adaptability, and resilience for all group members, not just the leaders. And by listening to the silence voices, we can understand that there are so many colors, so many faces in intergroup relationships. So it's not only about good, but so for example, between below, there are so many voices around these two big groups represented by particular leaders, but citizens actually have voices, and those voices are actually much more colorful than simple storylines about good versus evil or black versus white, for example. And they are marked by decreased attributions blaming one side as well as fewer negative attributes linked to. So by understanding those bystanders' voices, and we can create more the more positive positionings that it's actually not about the two groups, but it's actually more complex than this. So in overall, what we conclude in our chapter is that firstly, positioning theory as a tool for understanding conflict and peace has been widely applied in both research and practical interventions. So there are some examples that we put in the chapter, the Rwanda one that we've mentioned, and also there is a study using positioning theory in the context of Lebanon and the past conflicts in Molucca Islands, for example, and also in the Philippines. So there are some places where the idea about positioning theory and how it was applied in the conflicting relationship was used not only in the context of research, but also in the context of intervention. So yeah, positioning theory expands conflict analysis beyond immediate narratives. So it also consider historical narratives and silence voices, the citizens' voices, or the bystanders, and the conflicting relationship. And it contributes to peace building by helping actors to understand the dynamic of the conflict, encourage a shift from division to pattern of narrative to more dialogical. So I think that's all that we have in our chapter, and thank you very much.
Thank
I'm
you so much, Susilo, for that wonderful overview of the chapter and presentation of this work that I think we can all agree is incredibly timely. And what I would encourage folks to do, if you have a question or a comment, you're welcome to put it in the chat, but we're a small enough group too that if you are comfortable unmuting and asking a question or making a comment, you are welcome to do that. If you're able to and you have a question or comment, I would encourage you to turn on your video just so that Susilo and others have more of a feeling of personal engagement with you. If you prefer to put your comment or question in the chat, you're welcome to do that. Feel free to use the hand raise function or raise a physical hand if you would like to be called on. And those of you who are here to help me notice if somebody gets overlooked, if they've got a hand raised, because that occasionally happens. So I'll open things up here. Does anyone have a question or a comment for Susilo? Go ahead, Bo.
I can start. Thanks, Susilo, for a very interesting talk, I think. And I think I really like that the way you kind of like connected with the, I think, history of social psychology as well. Because when I hear what you're saying, I think about sheriff's camp studies and stuff like that as well. And so there's a clear history of this conflict research within social psychology and what you have done with as well. So, but the thing I was thinking about, and I think it's also a more general question, I think, in terms of positioning theory, because we tend to model groups on the person, right? I mean, because we use the same positioning theory tools, methods towards interpersonal interaction as well as intergroup interaction. And I was thinking whether there's not any, isn't there any some sort of difference between working with positioning when it comes to a group level instead of an individual level? And so I was wondering whether, I mean, I know it's probably a little bit of a tough question, but did you encounter some stuff within your research where the old model of just thinking about it in an interpersonal way doesn't really apply to when it comes to group level? Because something else might be going on as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much. But I lost the voice, the last part, but I think I get the point that you uh said. So yeah, I think like um working the context of intergroup conflict is much more complex rather than interpersonal relationship because groups is not only about like groups of people, but it's also contain the interpersonal relationship within each group. So that's it's quite more complex. And sometimes we need to identify whether a person position themselves as an individual or as part of a group. So it's about the personal and social identities, what they show up in the context of social relationship. So yeah, I think like um not sure about how they can shift from focusing on their social identities where they uh and they put or they position themselves as um the representation of their groups to where they focus on their uniqueness compared to the other people in the group. So yeah, I think that's my point because working with in the context of intergroups is more complex rather than in the context of interpersonal relations.
Okay, great. So you would see positioning theory as some sort of development of Teifel's way of thinking about social identity theory, right? Or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, okay, great.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Susilo, for being up in the middle of the night to do your presentation. That's lovely, and thank you for your presentation. A follow-up question, and I have is how might you think about some of what you and your co-author learned as you engaged in the work you engaged in for your chapter? And how much, and I know this is a question, just like Bo said, this is not an easy one for any of us, but how might you take some of your key insights to help us understand what's going on right now, for example, in the Middle East or in Ukraine? I mean, could you take some of your key insights and kind of apply those to what's happening now in the world?
Yeah, we are starting our journey from social identity theory rather than from positioning theory actually as social psychology, because social identity theory is much more popular and mostly used by most of social psychologists. And then we got this opportunity to work with positioning theory, and Winnifred, my supervisor, was contributing to a chapter on positioning theory that was edited by Fathali Muqaddam. And the learning process that we experienced during the writing of the chapter is actually, there is a very important thing in social relationship, which is like individual or groups, they always position themselves in the social relationships. And the key to create more peaceful relationship, and that's all what we want and what social psychologists think mostly in the context of social psychology, is actually how to build more peaceful relationship across different groups, across different identities, across different individuals, etc. And positioning is very important because it have consequences not only in the context of assigned rights and duties, but also how we perceive rights and duties of others. So we mean with the others here, so they can be out groups, the opposite groups, or they can be bystanders, and we can perceive them as our allies or we can perceive them as our enemies, or we can perceive them as the allies of our enemies. So it's more complex relationships, and positioning theory will help us to map those relationships on how a group look at the other, and those may have rights and perceived duties, but also will have implications on the identities itself, how they define themselves and how they define others in those social relationships. And the basic thing, I think the most principal things about like building more peaceful relationship is firstly is about understanding the complexities around these positionings and what factors that might influence people position themselves and position others and the consequences of these positionings. So that's what we learned so far, because although maybe people don't call it as the positioning theory explicitly, there are so many works in the past that's especially in the context of peace building efforts and post-conflict situation, they actually strongly consider the positioning idea in their work. Like the one that I cited in our chapter is the conflict in Molucca Island, where they use the term of Urang Basudara or something, which means they strengthen on how they position the others, their past enemies, as their brothers now. So it's, I mean, that work didn't explicitly mention the positioning theory, but it's actually the idea about shifting the position from enemies to brothers. So it's like long-term work, years of work, but there are so many narratives involved in this shifting process from the opposite groups or enemies into brothers. So that's what we learned through this writing process.
May I ask a follow-up question, Mary?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Cindy.
Well, what I think I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I've misinterpreted some of what you said, Susilo, but what I think I'm hearing you say is even in the chapter that you did, were you looking at cases where the narrative or the process shifted in terms of how people positioned themselves in one another to a more positive? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. And so part of me wonders in different instances, and here I'm thinking, for example, in Northern Ireland, how the narrative shifted historically. I'm thinking of the work of Elvi Ndura, who looked at, she was from, is from Burundi, and she looked at, and she's looked at the trying to deal with the conflict there and make changes. I'm wondering what are the levers for some of those shifts? I wonder if that could be a useful way to think about, or maybe you've already thought about that. I'm wondering what you think.
Sorry, I don't really get the questions actually. Could you please repeat it again?
Well, in contexts where, if I heard you correctly, I think you were talking about contexts where these shifting processes have occurred, and so people are repositioning others in different ways that are more peaceful and productive. And what I'm wondering is, what are some of the levers that bring about some of the shifts that you mentioned? Is that something you studied?
Not specifically, I think. So what I mean, my empirical study using positioning theories actually just focus in the Hezbollah and Israel conflicts, and then so that's the very first time we try to apply the positioning theory in the real conflict relationships. So we are in the middle of the data analysis actually, so I'm not sure about it yet. Sorry.
I have a related question, or sorry, Bo, can I ask my question first, or do you want to? One of the things you mentioned is that a lot of the work that people have done or writing around this involves thinking about positions, but it's implicit, right? They're not necessarily talking about positioning explicitly or using a positioning theory or maybe other types of ways of analyzing those specific positions. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what shifts when the focus on positions. In this case, we're talking about using positioning theory as a useful tool, but what shifts when the focus on positionings becomes explicit rather than implicit? Like, is that helpful in analysis? Is it helpful in a practical way in addressing, in-group, out-group conflicts, perceptions? What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I think that would be better because we have more clear framework from positioning theory, which was applied in so many different settings, from, for example, teacher students relationship, patient doctors relationships, nurse doctors relationships, and 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 from those empirical studies we built this positioning theories, and there are there are more, like, let's say, uh established theories of positioning, established theories about, for example, the consequences of positionings and different types of acts and speech acts and storylines, for example. So if we use this positioning theory more explicitly, I believe that will make the attempts not only to understand the conflict and peace, in particular social relationship on groups, but also in more practical stuff on in the interventions of peace and conflict, so that will be much more effective. So that's my understanding, because like there are so many people, so many attempts to create more peaceful relationship in different places, and most people who work in the field, they're not actually scholars of particular disciplines like positioning theory or social psychologists, but they take like more practical understandings from those theories, and they directly apply those theories to um, start the process or maintain the process. And this is mostly through the years and how they deal with the challengings, with the barriers in the field when they try to build more peaceful relationship through this positioning stuff, positioning theory. So if we use the established theories more accurately, so I believe that will be more effective, not only in understanding more about the different types of conflicting relationship, but also to more practically shift the conflict relationship into more peaceful one.
Okay, thank you. That's it's really interesting to hear your thoughts on that and to think about that idea. Bo, I know you had a question, so maybe we'll take yours and then whoever else has comments or
Yeah, I was thinking that you operate with a category of bystanders and silent voices in a certain sense. So I was thinking about whether you could say a little bit more of that, because I was thinking about in the terms of the them, other, and us positioning. Are these part of the others, or are they simply a third category, which we usually don't think about or don't see within this us and them positioning? And then it's up to the researcher to perhaps to kind of like position them or bring them out, or how is that done? How do you think about that?
So I think it's different between standards and the silence voice that we just to make sure that everyone can hear my voice.
we can hear you
Okay.
now. You're cut out for a
Yeah,
little.
sorry, because I got my screen that my internet connection is unstable, so sometimes I'm freezing. So in one of our book, we tried to identify the how groups position them, not how groups position, how we identify different roles or different, we call it as different roles in social relationships. So especially in the conflict and peace relationship. So there is a group and there is an opposite of the groups. So we call them as the opponents, and there is bystanders, and there is a third party. So the third parties is mostly about the mediators that have more power than the conflicting groups. I mean, practically we can say the government, for example, in the context of particular intergroup conflicts. And then there is also the bystanders. So the other groups do not belong to one group and the opponents of these groups. But the silence voice is can be anywhere actually, and they don't have a salient voice about the conflict, but they might get the implication of the conflicting relationships. So it can be because in the groups, there are mostly a kind of hierarchies or simply, and there are followers, but the hierarchies, and at the bottom of the social hierarchies, there are peoples or group of peoples who got the implications of the conflict and peaceful relationship, but their voice is ignored. Their voice is neglected, and people almost never listen what actually they want to say in the relationships. So as part of the peace building relationship, we need to also consider the voices of these silence people to better understand the real relationships between the group and the opponents and the group and the bystanders, for example, or the group and the third parties. So let's say the government, for example, in the particular intergroup conflicts. So that's actually different. So bystanders is silence voice, not just bystanders. They have particular opinion, they have particular storylines about the conflicts, but people never focus on them because people like takes much more attention to what the leaders say, and then they just ignore the citizens, the common people's voices. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Hi, this is Daniel from Stockholm in the middle of the day, not in the middle of the night. Thank you for the presentation, and I haven't read your chapter fully, so I'm sorry about that and so on. But I was what Bo was saying and so on about how do you what is the theoretical framework when you talk about voices and dialogue? Because in your chapter you there's no reference to, for instance, Bakhtin or to Paulo Freire, but you talk about you use that type of wording as I see it from my I'm just a PhD student, so what do I know? But yeah, what I heard. So what is the theory behind that? Because I know that you have a reference to Bresco, who uses Bakhtin, for instance. So what is a silent voice, and how is the what is voices in your theoretical framework? What does that mean? Do you understand my question? How do you understand voices?
Not really actually, but what I try to understand it, like the main thing that we want to say in our chapter is that we need to consider those voices because in positioning theory, we need to, when we want to bring this positioning theory into more empirical world, we need the data. And when we talk about the intergroup stuff, it's not only about the leaders that become our focus of analysis using this positioning theory, but also what the silence voices say about the positions, about the conflicts, about the peace, for example, and we need to understand those voices. And one of the other ways that we might do, or I think like Christina Montiel from the University of Philippines also used to, I think I cite her study in the Philippines and in the Philippine and China relationships, the contact of South China Sea, something. So they consider the voices of general peoples, like we can't use the data that we can consider as the representations of those voices, for example, through the social media conversations, like this will never become a focus when we look at the conflicts, especially because we just focus on what the leaders or the main figures say about the conflicts, and then we just ignore the the citizens' voices. So that's what we try to say. about it, because by understanding the silence voice, we can look at the positions and stuff as more complex and way beyond the good versus bad, or good versus evil, for example. So yeah, that's what we try to say in our chapter. Thank you for the question, Daniel.
I think if I could just also follow up on that, I think it's a really interesting question, Daniel, about like the issue of voices and also how we think about that, because one of the things that we did not have in the handbook was anything that focused on, for example, the possible synergies between positioning theory and dialogue, or you mentioned the work of Freire as well. And I think that there's certainly aspects of thinking about that. One of the things that I was thinking about as Susilo was talking was that if we think about the general voices of the people, where do those individual and collective voices come from, right? And so that made me think about that Bakhtinian notion of dialogue and the voices of others that we always carry within us, and of course Freire's work about the whole notion of reading the word and reading the world, and those aspects. I think there's a lot of potential there. I think that goes well beyond the chapter that you would have had to write another chapter, Susilo, to address all of those types of things. But it makes me think that for possible future iterations of the handbook, that might be something definitely worth including. And if folks know of, I'm trying to think too of places where anybody has really written longer works that have connected that. And I'm not thinking of any. I think there might be some folks in education who have used those different frameworks in empirical studies, but it's an interesting question, and I think one worth considering in the future in some way.
Yep. Yeah.
I think that sorry, Mary, but I think that Arthur Frank in the dialogical narrative analysis DNA approach is picking up Bakhtin and actually using. I think Catherine Riesman is using empirical data. Okay, we look at the voices of these girls fighting in the classroom, from different perspective, using this DNA and Bakhtin in a way that what is in one single voice, which voices can be heard, yeah, that type of, I think, could be interesting.
Yep. Thank you very much for the.
I just have a quick comment. What is the role or question, I guess, and this goes back to what Cindy was saying about those levers for change. And certainly here in the US, I would love to see something we could pull and have that automatic change. But what is the role of criticality in all of this? We're headed toward these studies of power when we're talking about those marginalized voices that have been silenced. And how do we move from an argument, say, to actual studies of positioning in a formal on a world stage, I guess, where does the consideration of all of these things fit in? By criticality, I mean paying direct attention to culture, the history, the context, the power relationships. How might that be the part that moves from the argument to the awareness of positioning?
I'm not sure, but I think the power dynamics is very important in the group's relationships, especially when we consider that the like the balance of powers between groups who engage in peace or conflict relationships. So yeah, may consider that thing,
Okay.
but I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Nick Marak. Sorry, I can't turn on my camera. I work in a building that does not have cameras. I'm a fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and thank you, Cecilia, for this wonderful presentation and bringing attention to positioning in the context that you were talking about. I wanted to comment also on Grace, something that you had mentioned. I think it is also really important to take a critical approach to examining power. And something, Cecilia, I was wondering is if within your, and sorry, I also did not read the chapter yet, but the positioning and positioning theory and dialogue with like master narratives, in which the folks that sort of maintain or are able to align with those master narratives are also able to maintain power. And then second, whether or not in a applied or way to operationalize positioning, considerations for destabilizing power through, for instance, counter narratives. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that responding to Grace's questions at all?
Yeah, I was trying to latch on to Grace's question and perhaps
Thank
add
you.
further context to mine and also ask a question. Sorry about that.
What was the question? Sorry, like
Did you hear the question, Susilo? Because I noticed at one point you looked like you were frozen, so I'm wondering
yeah,
if
that's
you missed part of Nick's question.
yeah. I thought that was responding to Grace's questions, and then
Okay.
but I didn't hear the questions, Tristan.
Sorry, yes.
Okay.
If you could perhaps speak on the relationship between positioning master narratives and critical approaches to understanding power.
Critical.
Approaches to understanding power.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about this part actually, but as I have said that in the conflicting relationship, the power dynamics is understanding the power dynamics is very important, and how to create not only the more positive positionings or more positive narratives between the groups who involve the conflicts, but also to create the balance of the powers of the groups. So yeah, I think that's, although we didn't strongly emphasis on this power dynamics in our chapter because we mostly focus on the narratives rather than this power dynamics and power balance in the conflict. Yeah, mostly just focus on the narratives.
I do think, Nick, that my own take on your questions is that there's definitely a lot of potential, I think, for positioning theory studies to do work in this area. And one example that I've seen in work that we've done with with teachers and thinking about how teachers have begun individually and collectively in small groups of, say, 5 to 25 people, to question some of the master or meta narratives, particularly around race and class intersectionalities related to literacy, performance. I've seen that on that small scale. I think in the work that Susilo is talking about, where a lot of this is with larger groups, right? We're talking about societies or groups within groups or countries even. Obviously, it's quite different, but I think that overall, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential there for work to be done.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely agree. Lately, or more recently, I've been shifting gears with how I apply positioning to security studies, specifically narratives surrounding national security in the United States. I feel like that's depressingly relevant right now, but there's a lot of data to look at. So thank you again.
I think that all of this is extremely relevant, not just in a US context, but obviously globally and in these different regional aspects, and then within various subgroups within countries or regions as well. I think the work is incredibly important. And as someone said in one of the meetings I was in recently, hope is an action. And so even though sometimes it can get really depressing to think about some of these conflict areas, whether it's in our own personal lives, in our own organizational settings, or on a national scale, I think one of the things that's helpful to think about is how do we position ourselves in terms of our own actions to keep moving forward. I really we're almost out of time, so I think we need to close here. But thank you, Susilo, for presenting this chapter, and what a wonderful, rich set of questions that folks have raised today. I think this is the perfect appetizer, teaser to the talk that Ali Moghadam is going to present next week. So I would encourage you to all attend that, and also please share that talk and work with others. I think it's really timely. I really appreciate this community, and thank you again, Susilo, for presenting.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much, everyone. I acknowledge that I need to learn more about this positioning theory. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, we
It's
appreciate your contribution to the handbook. Thank you, everybody, and we will look forward to seeing you next week as we learn from Ali Moghadam.
Yep.
Thank
See
you.
ya.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.